of explosive demolition, fire not being able to account for any one of these. With additional corroborating circumstantial evidence, we believe this is proof of controlled demolition, and it's a huge problem for the official story because we're told fire brought these buildings down. If we were lied to about World Trade Center 7, what else were we lied to about? Let's take a look. In the Twin Towers, we have features of controlled demolition too. Let's take a look. Sudden onset of destruction, not at the location, at the base of the towers, but at the location of jet plane impacts, interestingly enough, because these are deceptive controlled demolitions, blamed on the jet plane impacts and fires. Where we hear sounds of explosions heard by first responders, flashes of light seen by them in the oral histories, which were recorded the month after 9/11, and which were hidden from public view until the court forced the release of this. Why? Is it because 118 and more of them are talking about what they heard in terms of explosions, what they experienced in the building, and what they saw? Let's see. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, just one flash. Then it kept popping all the way around the building, and the building had started to explode. One floor under another. I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. Seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions. Let's see what they might be referring to. World Trade Center 1 on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Belts of explosions starting at the midpoint, not necessarily at the bottom. Is there any similarity? Sudden, continuous drop. Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. I saw low-level flashes. We actually heard the pops. You heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, initially an orange and then a red flash came out of the building. Let's see what the South Tower looks like. Is there any similarity to it on the right side and a known controlled demolition on the left? We think so. I saw a flash, flash, flash. Then it looked like the building came down. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. What did these first responders experience?
We started floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Detonated.
They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
Are they credible witnesses? Well, let's take a look at a little simple physics lesson. What happens when a large truck runs into a small car? Which one wins? Okay, the stronger structure. Does it matter if we drop the light car onto the heavier truck? No. Obviously, an analogy. The lighter part of a structure cannot destroy the heavier part below. They are crushed in an equal and opposite destructive force. Watch, in fact, what happens. The upper structure is destroyed after you see, like the first responders said, belts of explosions, and this upper part is, in fact, being destroyed itself in what appears to be a miniature controlled demolition, not unlike World Trade Center 7. Now, what's happening after that? A large explosion, laterally distributed pulverized building materials trailed by pyroclastic-like smoke clouds, landing 600 feet away. World Trade Center 1 on the left, a known volcanic eruption on the right. Is there any similarity to what we might expect a gravitational collapse to behave like? No. We're looking at very explosive event. Look below. Oops. These laterally distributed pulverized building materials land 1,200 feet in every direction, well outside the boundaries of ground zero. Are there explosive charges going off 20, 40, even 60 stories down? Indeed, as documented here in this video. We're told that these are puffs of air being produced by that giant piston, the upper 12 stories in the case of World Trade Center 1, pushing air down the elevator shafts, and it's got to come out somewhere, right? Well, these are not puffs of air. They're clearly pulverized building materials. They're being ejected at 160 to 200 feet per second and 20 to 60 stories down, in obviously an engineered pattern, often at the midpoint between the corners of the building. Do we have a near free fall pace through the path of greatest resistance? Well, this building comes down in somewhere between 9 and 12 seconds. That is nearly free fall acceleration. And it is accelerating straight down through 80,000 tons of structural steel framework that must have been removed before this building's descent or during it in a very precisely timed manner, because we also have the total dismemberment of this structure during the event, where the steel skeleton is completely broken up and distributed outside the perimeter of these buildings. Watch the South Tower in terms of dismemberment. It begins to tip over, and yet, even after 22 degrees off-center, we still have a symmetrical collapse down below. So we have asymmetrical loading from this block that's falling, continuing theoretically its angular momentum. We'd expect it to fall in one massive heap down there, right? We have asymmetrical damage from the fires, and we have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes. And yet, watch from below, complete symmetrical destruction all the way down, like the firemen described, belts of explosions all the way down to the ground. Watch down below. What are we looking at? Are we looking at a pancaking collapse, or are we looking at a series of explosions and complete destruction all the way down to the ground? Ejecting laterally, as you can see, freely flying objects, structural steel sections, landing 300 to 600 feet in every direction. It's not a banana peeling, it's free-flying objects. And these take an extraordinary amount of energy, enough energy to eject a cannonball, a 200-pound cannonball, 3 miles. And so where are the floors if everything's being ejected laterally? We would expect to find 110 floors stacked up at the base of each of these towers. What do we see? Only a 2-story pile on the left of core columns, perimeter columns, and so forth. On the right, we have a pancaking collapse. We might expect to see something a lot more like that. But we don't. We have the complete destruction of the steel structure and the complete pulverization of 90,000 tons of concrete, which we would expect in floors stacked up, but which is pulverized, as you can see here, in midair, landing in a 3-square-mile area completely across lower Manhattan in a blanket 12 to 15 centimeters thick. In that dust, the World Trade Center dust, we find all kinds of interesting evidence. In fact, evidence of extreme high temperature in the piles themselves, 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Pouring out of the South Tower, we have liquid molten iron or steel. We can tell by the temperature, by the color, that its temperatures exceed the melting point of iron, as a matter of fact. We're told that this is melted airplane aluminum, right? But it can't be, because melted aluminum is silvery. It doesn't glow bright orange, yellow in sunlight. The World Trade Center structural engineer himself, Leslie Robertson, describes a river of steel. These are extremely hot temperatures, of course, that office fires and jet fuel can't even approach. Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile. What does this mean? Literally molten steel, says the president of the cleanup company. Steel members in the debris that appear to have been partially evaporated, which takes 3 to 4 times the temperatures associated with jet fuel or office fires. FEMA documents this in Appendix C of their report. Melting of steel capable of turning solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, which fire protection engineers, first responders have never seen the likes of these temperatures. Liquid iron is documented. Where does the liquid iron come from? Iron is not used in steel structures. This is not steel. How is concrete melted? 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. And yet this is the official response from the lead structural engineer of NIST about these high temperature phenomena.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava.
From a volcano.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Pretty interesting, because his fingerprint is all over the evaporated ends of these columns, and later he denies it. This is the piece that was saved for Appendix C, FEMA report. Well, again, World Trade Center fires maybe got 600 to 800 degrees centigrade, but structural steel doesn't melt until up to 1,500 degrees centigrade. What can create those temperatures? Let's look at one possible material, chemical reaction, thermite, an incendiary that releases 2,500 degree centigrade temperatures and can be responsible for the molten material dripping out of the debris in this tractor. Could thermite have produced all this? And what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
So all of the evidence must be looked at, not just that which supports our particular theory. In the case of NIST, this is completely overlooked. Thermite, of course, can be used in patented devices to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter, and is fully capable of destroying steel structures. Is there any evidence, though, of thermite in the World Trade Center dust? Well, There's enough dust to analyze, and the USGS does just that, along with the R.J. Lee group, and finds abundant iron microspheres, tiny iron microspheres the diameter of a human hair. They find in up to 6% of these dust samples is composed of these ubiquitous, previously molten iron microspheres, indicating tremendously hot temperatures that fire and jet fuel are not capable of, and indicating by their roundness that they were formed in the air, in midair, during the event, as USGS and R.J. Lee document. So, these spheres are produced as a result of a thermite reaction. Tens of thousands of them, as you see in this simple little experiment here. The iron spheres are analyzed, and they have the signature of thermite in them: sulfur, aluminum, iron, silica, oxygen. But what else was found in all this World Trade Center dust? Any unignited thermite, perhaps? In these samples, independently collected by this international team of scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen, they find in each of their samples hundreds of these small red-gray chips. The red side is composed of what? The exact ingredients of thermite. This should not be found in the World Trade Center dust at all. Iron, oxygen, silica, carbon. Let's zoom into the red layer 50,000 times. What do we see? Small, very small particles of iron oxide and aluminum powders that are 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. These are nanoscaled particles built from the atomic scale up. So they take these red chips, they put them in a heater. When they get up to 422 degrees centigrade, they ignite. What happens when these chips ignite in this heater, in this experiment? They produce iron spheres, the same iron spheres that are found in the World Trade Center dust by officials from the USGS that have no explanation. Well, here is the explanation. It's as clear as day. You see, it's an internally self-consistent set of evidence that can put a whole lot of people away for treason for a very long time if we can find the culprits of this material. Actually, it's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It's a very sophisticated process made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories in the U.S. Now, this work is documented in a 25-page peer-reviewed paper by the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. It stands uncontested. The way to contest somebody's conspiracy theory is to put forth your own peer-reviewed paper. This has not been done. So you see, all of these features are direct evidence not of fire, but of explosive destruction. Fire can't account for any one of them, let alone all 10 of them. So is our hypothesis corroborated? We believe so. In fact, as you can see, this evidence is clear and convincing and quite damning to the official story and of the events of 9/11. It's critical that everyone hearing this testimony take appropriate and timely action and not simply rely upon others to do what is necessary. There are many actions you can take as well, such as supporting these proceedings. I also refer you to our excellent series of DVDs, which are available outside in the back after the session, and to the special screening of our new movie at lunchtime right here in this room, 9/11 Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out, which includes the testimony of 43 of our petition signers, high-rise architects, structural engineers, scientists, controlled demolition experts, 9/11 family members, and many others, which we'll be submitting into the official record of these proceedings. As you can see, it is, in fact, critical that everyone, we also ask you to support our historic effort at AE 9/11 Truth to speak directly to every Muslim country in the world As you can imagine, we've not succeeded in the United States to bring this information, the story of the century, out in the mainstream media. This underscores the tremendous significance of these proceedings of the Pradana Global Peace Foundation. Please do whatever you can to carry this vital work forward. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Richard. Actually, we have about 10 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is to give an opportunity to the floor to ask questions, and some in-house rules. Please identify yourself and who you'd like the question to be directed at, and above all, please be brief, as we have another session coming up at 11:30. Thank you. The floor is open now.
Good morning.
Morning. Yep.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Muhammad Sarizan. I'd like to ask this question to Cynthia McKinney. I agree with you, there's been too much talk about September 11, it's been so many years, blah, blah, blah. So I'm a man of action. So rather than we just talk and talk and talk from one conference to another, and watch one DVD after another, read one book after another, why don't I propose to you, Cynthia, as a former US Congresswoman, file a suit in the US courts to bring this thing to the forefront, to gather more momentum on legal aspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. This is exactly the subject that we discussed last night in our meeting, because I would agree with you, but I think the members of the Pradana Peace Organization, of the Peace Foundation, as well as the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Commission, both agree that it is not enough for the collection of data. We have to do something with it. And we actually discussed last night the possibility of taking this issue into a court somewhere. And we also discussed utilizing US law, because US laws were broken, and utilizing some aspects of US law so that we could get a, how can I say, an investigation with teeth in it, with subpoena power, with the power of the state behind the effort. And then, of course, once you have that on the record, then it's far easier to proceed with a criminal action, which is what is required in this matter, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Cynthia. Yes, that gentleman who has been standing there for the last couple of minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Mohammed Peter Davis. I'm an ex-lecturer at University Putra, Malaysia for the last 20 years. So, as a scientist, I have complete agreement with all of the speakers this morning on the scientific evidence that the official explanation for 9/11 is a complete fraud and an outrageous fraud. But the expert studies do not answer the elementary question of who organized the 9/11 terrorist attack and why. Dr. Mahathir this morning asked the pertinent question, who benefited from 9/11? Now, I'm a follower of American statesman and economist Lyndon LaRoche, who has been addressing this question ever since the first 9/11 in 2001, and the second 9/11 in Benghazi, Libya, 2 months ago. He says the two are created by the same people. So LaRoche in the webcast last Friday concludes, and I quote, a British-Saudi combination ran 9/11, both in New York, September the 11th, 2001, and Benghazi, September the 11th, 2012. He says that, as a matter of fact, we are dominated by a cable of British control over the United States, shared with the Saudis. The two operations done by the British in New York City and in Benghazi, these two operations were both done by the British with the Saudis. In other words, a British-Saudi combination ran 9/11. And the Bush presidency and the Obama presidency have both covered up that fact. So the beneficiaries, according to LaRouche, is the British Empire, who have been organising continuous wars since the ouster of Bismarck in 1890.
Excuse me, sir. Sorry, I have to interrupt you there.
Yes.
Can I get members of the panel who would you like to, respond that? Because we are really running short of time, sir. Thank you very much.
If I can say something about that, I'd just like to differ with the premise of the question. I don't believe it's true that none of the presentations posited a potential who was behind the attacks or what potential causes or reasons they would have had for doing that. In my own presentation, I think I presented some evidence that even the official story of what happened on 9/11 would have required the active collusion of people like Defense Secretary Rumsfeld and Vice President Cheney. I also posited, at the very least, their involvement in the Project for a New American Century as a potential avenue of investigation, as well as the $2.3 trillion that was missing in the Pentagon's budget since fiscal year 1999. And in addition, there is, of course, much more evidence of other financial improprieties, et cetera, that we don't have time to go through today. And while I certainly do acknowledge that there is obviously a greater need to expand the investigation into collusion with other governments and other agencies around the world, I'm not sure, A, that was precluded by what was presented today, and B, I'm not sure if that was really possible to present all of that within the confines of my particular presentation. So I do understand that there is a greater need to expand this investigation, but I think we also have to look at the people within the United States government who would have had to have actively colluded to have made that possible.
Richard, would you like in 1 minute? Cynthia?
No, I think James has sufficiently responded.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I hate to do this, but I have to conclude the session because we have... because she's a woman, you're a woman. Okay, I'll exercise some flexibility.
Hello, my name is Farlina. I would actually, this question is directed to Mr. Richard Gage. I would just like to know, based on the scientific evidence, are the planes necessary to bring the buildings down?
No, the planes were probably irrelevant in the effort to bring the buildings down. In fact, NIST themselves acknowledged that the buildings did their job resisting the airplanes. They fault the fires an hour later for the destruction of the buildings, and they produce computer simulations that are quite fraudulent in order to try to prove that. So what's evident is that the explosive demolitions are what's responsible for bringing the buildings down.
Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have to conclude the first session, and judging from the views and what was presented by the panelists, Cynthia, James, and Richard, who are all experts in their own little field, I think there's much food for thought for session number 4 this afternoon. So thank you very much for your indulgence, for the interest that you have shown this morning. We are very happy with the crowd in the room. And on your behalf, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Cynthia, James, and Richard. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again to our very distinguished panel for their revelations. And as we've been presented with mind-blowing evidence, as we move on to our next session, as conspiracy theories become conspiracy facts. We continue with the next session, but before that, I'd like to make a special announcement. I'd like to inform you that the Pradana Global Peace Foundation will be organizing this emergency event tomorrow. It is called Malaysians Condemn the Unjust War in Gaza. And it is a convening of NGOs, members of the public, members of the media, you, ladies and gentlemen. It will be held at the foyer at level 2 of this building. And we wish to call upon all of you here and all Malaysians to stand up and be counted in this support initiative. Please, we need you. And once again, I'd like to remind you, it is at the foyer at level 2, and that is before the hearing, the War Crimes Commission hearing on Palestine at 10 a.m. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to call upon the participants of the next session, Fear Syndrome. Please welcome your chairman, Tan Sri Hasmi Agam, chairman of Suhakam. Also onto the stage, Professor Michelle Chossudovsky, professor of economics, University of Ottawa, Professor Graham McQueen, author and organizer of the Toronto 9/11 hearings, Professor Niloufar Bhagwat, professor of comparative constitutional law at the University of Mumbai, India.
Yang amat berbahagia Tun Dr. Mahathir and Tun Dr. Sri Hasmah. Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a great pleasure for me to be asked to moderate the second session entitled 9/11 rather, the Fear Syndrome. Now, in the first session, we had revisited the event. Many of us were skeptics of the so-called conspiracy theory. I was one of them. Although it happened that I was in New York at the time when it happened. And I must tell you this, that immediately after the attack, the report was carried in the news media, particularly TV, indicated that they found 2 or 3 passports of the so-called attackers in the debris of the World Trade Center. I'm not a very clever man, but I told my wife, how could this happen? This is ridiculous. The whole building was demolished. And I myself had a personal encounter, experience of fear, being in New York at the time. In the morning, I was going to the UN to attend a small ceremony by Kofi Annan, which he usually did before the opening of the General Assembly at the Japanese Garden. Very small ceremony. I had missed the previous occasions, so I thought this time around I wouldn't miss it. So I was on the way there when my social secretary told me, "Sir, the Twin Towers have been struck." I was shocked. I said, "What happened?" She said, "Very few details." And anyway, I rushed to the UN premises, a very small crowd, but less than half a dozen, and asked people, isn't there any crowd? They said, "Didn't you hear? The World Trade Center had been hit." I was relieved because I thought it was our Twin Towers in KL. We shouldn't spend so much time to have it directed. But of course, I was really taken aback at the tragic event. And soon enough, the Deputy Chief of Protocol came to extend apologies to Kofi Annan, to cancel the whole ceremony, and to advise us to rush back to our premises, which we did. And as you're walking back, there was speculation among us that perhaps the UN could be another attack, could be another target. So the mission was only about 5 minutes away from the UN. But when I arrived there, I saw the second attacks which has already taken place. So, I mean, really, it was very shocking to see 2 buildings being down. Anyway, in the first session, we had revisited the subject. A lot of questions were raised. So if there are any more skeptics among you about the so-called conspiracy theory, I don't know. I must have my own personal experience, as I told you, which lingered in my mind. Anyway, in this second session, we're going to examine the subject of the fear syndrome. Mine was a personal fear that I went through and my family went through. But our speakers today will examine the subject in a broader context. We are very fortunate to have with us this morning 3 distinguished speakers, namely Professor Misha Shudovsky, to my right, Professor Graham McQueen, and Professor Nilofer Bhagwat, who will talk on this very important subject. Their CVs are already in the program, so I will just very briefly mention them. Our first speaker, Michel Shudovsky, is Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Ottawa. He is the founder and director of the Center for Research on Globalization, Montreal, and editor of Global Reach website. The professor is well known to many of us as a signatory of the Kuala Lumpur Declaration to Criminalize War. Our second speaker, Professor Graham McQueen, is Professor Emeritus in Religious Studies in McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, and is co-founder of McMaster's Center for Peace Studies. Professor McQueen started investigating events of 9/11 in 2005 and is on the steering committee of the international hearings in Toronto on the events of 9/11. He will talk about his own exploration and the contradictions of the official narrative. Our third speaker is Professor Nilofer Bhagwat, who is Professor of Comparative Constitutional Law, University of Mumbai. She is also Vice President of the Indian Association of Lawyers, New Delhi. Professor Bhagwat was awarded the Philip Jessup Award of the American Society of International Law at Washington. The professor served as a panel judge in the Tokyo International Criminal Tribunal on Afghanistan and also at the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Tribunal hearing. So on that brief introductory notes, ladies and gentlemen, may I now invite our first speaker. Now, they each have, they want a lot of time to speak, but we have only 1.5 hours, 90 minutes. So I do hope that in making the presentation, which requires time, they keep in mind that if they speak 30 minutes each, we will not have any Q&A. So if they can bear it in mind, so please, Professor.
I don't know. I have a computer here, which is a bit of a problem. Okay, thank you. Oops. Can you just remove the computer? Yeah, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers, I think we are indebted to Tun Mahathir for having brought the agenda of 9/11 back onto the drawing board of debate. This is a historical decision because it is something which is increasingly forgotten in the coverage of the mainstream media, not to mention the political rhetoric underlying what is described as the global war on terrorism, which is called GWOT. So what is GWOT? The tragic events of September 11, 2001 constitute a fundamental landmark in American history, a decisive watershed, a breaking point. September 11, 2001 opens up an era of crisis, upheaval, It is not only the events themselves, but as Tun Mahathir has indicated, it is the crimes committed in the name of 9/11. In other words, we must distinguish between the crimes of 9/11 and the crimes committed in the name of 9/11. And these crimes committed in the name of 9/11, which also involve a wave of Islamophobia, of demonization of Muslims, but also the destruction of entire countries. That is what is meant by the crimes committed in the name of 9/11, as opposed to the acts of destruction and the loss of life on the morning of 9/11. The two events are symbiotically related. They're two dimensions of a criminal process. I have had the opportunity of being involved now for almost 7 years with the Kuala Lumpur war crimes procedure, both the commission as well as the tribunal. And I wish to address, because our initiative ultimately is intended to go towards a legal procedure. Okay? This conference is a preamble to a process of indictment of the war crimes committed in the name of 9/11. And these war crimes committed in the name of 9/11 are crimes against civilization. They're far-reaching because they involve the declaration of at least 2 major war theaters, one of which was Afghanistan, declared right in the wake 3 weeks after, 3 or 4 weeks, 26 days after the event. And then you had, of course, Iraq. And in all of America's initiatives, its military initiatives, 9/11 has been the pretext and the justification on humanitarian grounds for going after the terrorists, okay? Notwithstanding the fact, known and documented, that Al-Qaeda is made in America. Please understand, Al-Qaeda is an intelligence asset of the Central Intelligence Agency. It is an instrument. It was created in 1979 at the outset of the Soviet-Afghan War. And if you look at the history, you realize not only that Al-Qaeda is a creation of the CIA, but Al-Qaeda remains an instrument of covert warfare in different parts of the world. Al-Qaeda are the foot soldiers of NATO and the Western Military Alliance in places like Syria and Libya. To the extent that realities are twisted upside down. I started my research on 9/11 on the very day of 9/11 in an article which was called "Who is Osama bin Laden?" And I understood from the very outset that if Osama bin Laden were to be held responsible for 9/11, it followed pari passu that the CIA, as a state sponsor of Al-Qaeda, was possibly behind these horrendous acts. However, bear in mind, and I wish to dwell a bit on the chronology. On September 10th, talking about technology, on September 10th, according to Dan Rather, CBS News, Osama bin Laden was in a military hospital in Rawalpindi, Pakistan. Now, Rawalpindi is a military city, headquarters of the Pakistani military and intelligence. It's a place which is swarming with U.S. military advisors. You do not enter the urology ward of the Rawalpindi military hospital unnoticed. The Al-Qaeda leader, alleged Al-Qaeda leader, Osama bin Laden, was hospitalized on the 10th of September. Now, following Richard Gage's presentation, we should beg the question, how on earth did bin Laden coordinate these attacks from his hospital bed in the urology ward of the Pakistani military hospital, from his laptop, presumably? I suspect that they had Wi-Fi connection in the hospital, but this particular event, which was reported by CBS News, is crucial in understanding the chronology. Because first of all, he was hospitalized on the 10th, which assumes that he was probably released the day after, okay? Don't go into hospital, come out. Released the day after, so that the question is, first of all, how could he himself have coordinated these attacks? And secondly, his whereabouts were known. And Donald Rumsfeld made the statement, and I cite textually, "We don't know where he is. It's like looking for a needle in a stack of hay." Hello, Donald Rumsfeld. Osama bin Laden was in a Pakistani military hospital. Pakistan is a close military ally of the United States of America. The United States of America has an intelligence and military mission right within walking distance of the hospital, and you are telling us that you don't know where bin Laden was on September 11, 2001. And he certainly was not in Afghanistan, he was in Pakistan. So that is one important element in the jigsaw. Now let me get back to the chronology of 9/11. I'll start later in the evening. We've discussed the earlier part, the morning, but the evening is very important. On 9:30 p.m., a war cabinet is formed. There was no war cabinet. They create a war cabinet out of thin air. Early in the morning, CIA Director George Tenet confirmed, that was in fact at 11 in the morning, he said Al-Qaeda is behind it, okay? Now, he had absolutely no evidence as to who was behind it, but he said Al-Qaeda was behind it, and the media response immediately on the morning of September 12th was to discuss who are the state sponsors of this attack. So first of all, Al-Qaeda is held responsible with absolutely no evidence. And then at 9:30 in the evening, the war cabinet meets and the global war on terrorism is officially launched. And there is an official declaration of war against an impoverished country in Central Asia, namely Afghanistan, which allegedly attacked America on September 11, 2001. Now this fact is also something which the media, the analysts, or even the politicians have chosen to ignore, because both official statements as well as Western media reports say we will not make any distinction between the terrorists and the state sponsors of terror. And it was assumed that Al-Qaeda was supported by a foreign government, namely the government of Afghanistan, which the United States refers to the Taliban, okay? The Taliban. And George Bush, during his election campaign, thought the Taliban were a rock group, but that's another matter. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that the War Cabinet at 11 o'clock at night took the decision to declare war on Afghanistan. The following morning in Brussels, and if you bear in mind jet lag, time difference, virtually the Atlantic Council met in Brussels on the morning of September 12th, local time, and took the decision to invoke Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an attack against one member of the Atlantic Alliance, namely NATO, is an attack against all members of the Atlantic Alliance under the doctrine of collective security. And what was implied by a tentative decision on the morning of September 12th by NATO was that the so-called Atlantic area was attacked by a foreign power, which was unnamed, but it was understood that it was Afghanistan. Okay? Now, by no stretch of the imagination, irrespective of our understanding of the events of September 11, whether we believe the official story or not, but under no stretch of the imagination was there any evidence that Afghanistan had attacked America. But in terms of legal decision-making, both the War Cabinet on September 11 at 11 o'clock at night, followed a few hours later, a.m., in Brussels, European Central Time, took the decision to wage war on Afghanistan based on Article 5, and they took on, I'll read a section of the resolution. If it is determined that the September 11, 2001 attack against the United States was directed from abroad against the North Atlantic area, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. Okay? So that NATO essentially declares war, at least tentatively declares war, against Afghanistan, which is a criminal act, a violation of international law, in the name of 9/11 on the morning of September 12th. Bin Laden was not in Afghanistan, he was in Pakistan, but also on the morning of September 12th, General Mahmoud Ahmad, who was the head of Pakistani's military intelligence, the inter-services intelligence, was in Washington, happened to be in Washington. It's a long story. I outline this in my book, which incidentally is available at the desk, America's War on Terrorism, that on the morning of September 12th, General Ahmad, who according to press reports, including Reuters reports, was the so-called alleged money man behind the terrorists, was called to the State Department for meetings with Richard Armitage, Deputy Secretary of State, but also Colin Powell, and they asked him to act on behalf of the Pakistani government in going after the terrorists, in other words, participating in the war on Afghanistan. So you see right from the beginning how realities are twisted. The money man behind 9/11, the alleged supporters of Al-Qaeda, which is well documented, ISI, but also in liaison with the CIA, are invited to participate in the global war on terrorism on the one hand, and Afghanistan is accused of attacking America. Okay? I didn't see in any of the images Afghanistani planes coming and attacking America. But that is what is implied by the invocation of Article 5. Now, from September 12th onwards, several important events occurred. The Afghan government, through diplomatic sources, contacted the Bush administration on 2 occasions, saying that if there were any evidence, preliminary evidence, to the fact that Osama bin Laden were behind these attacks, they would gladly remit Osama bin Laden to the U.S. justice and law enforcement apparatus. Okay? Now, these initiatives on the part of the Afghani, I don't use the term the Taliban, Afghani government, sovereign country, were made, they're on record. And George W. Bush responded, "We don't negotiate with terrorists." Okay? They brushed off the initiative of the Afghan government to deliver the alleged terrorist to U.S. justice, but no negotiations ensued. This is not to be surprised, because essentially 9/11, which is described in intelligence parlance as a massive casualty-producing event, creating countless civilian deaths, and also in the mindset of millions of people, the legitimacy and the pretext are there. Okay? People didn't question the act, the declaration of war, because they were so much affected emotionally by the loss of life, particularly the American public, on the morning of 9/11. But essentially, what is at stake is that 9/11 was the trigger mechanism for the installation of the global war on terrorism, and the first stretch of this global war on terrorism was Afghanistan. Now, bear in mind, I don't know how many months it has taken to organize this conference. Flashback to 2001, anybody who has a minimal understanding of military planning or conference planning will tell you don't organize a large-scale theater war thousands of miles away in Central Asia in a matter of 26 days, okay? Impossible. From the 11th of September to the 26th to the 7th of October, 26 days, you do not put together the logistics of a major theater war, invasions, warplanes, naval deployment, and so on and so forth, going after Osama bin Laden, allegedly in the Tora Bora Mountains. In other words, and there were press reports to that effect, this war was in the final stages of preparation prior to the advent of the 9/11 attacks. And that's absolutely fundamental. But the military analysts, again, the same as the official investigators of the causes of the collapse of the towers, didn't come to the most obvious conclusion, hey, hello, you don't plan a theater war in 26 days, okay? Let alone an international conference on 9/11, which we've been planning for months, okay? So that the war on terror, the war on Afghanistan was in the pipeline well before 9/11. 9/11 was the trigger to wage this war, and this, again, was something which was withheld from the broader public. People didn't beg that question. Now, on the morning of September 12th, 2001, when the Atlantic Council met in Brussels, they indeed invoked Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, collective defense. It's an act of self-defense to go and attack Afghanistan, but they said we must have proof that in effect that both Al-Qaeda as well as Afghanistan were behind this attack, and they, in a sense, requested the US State Department to follow up on that, and the State Department appointed a few days later an individual called Frank Taylor. Now, Frank Taylor was a senior US State Department official. He was entrusted with writing a brief. He was a consultant to establish whether the US had been attacked from abroad, okay, which is a legal term of Article 5, whether the United States had been attacked from abroad, which visibly anybody who had looked at the images say, no, it hasn't, okay, whatever one's interpretation of these events. And so that US Ambassador at Large, Frank Taylor, briefed the North Atlantic Council. It took him 2 weeks to do his report, okay? And on the 2nd of October, which is 5 days before the commencement of the bombings, he briefed the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council had already ordered the deployment of large-scale weapons systems to Central Asia, even before 9/11. But on the 2nd of October, he handed his brief to NATO, and this brief, to this date, remains classified. It was never released either to the press or to any, so that when Secretary General Lord Robertson summarized the substance of the brief, but he didn't say, but the brief was never published. We intend to get hold of that brief. And he then said on the morning of October 12th, yes, we now confirm the decision that we took on September 12th to attack Afghanistan and to initiate the global war on terrorism. And 5 days later, it was all-out war against Afghanistan. Now, let me flash forward, because in effect, if you look at US military doctrine, which was totally revamped in the wake of 9/11, you will see that all the so-called enemies of the United States, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and many more, which were on the list of General Clark, you know, the famous list of countries which are on the roadmap for US-led war. When the war on Iraq was in its advanced stage of readiness in the early months of 2003, Colin Powell, Secretary of State Colin Powell, presented a justification to the United Nations